Next question is from Charles Pafaf. I think that's how I spell his name. And he just mentioned that we didn't cover any Nu-Trek ships, and that's partially because, of course, we were focusing on the Dominion War era. But I think we've talked a little bit here and there. I mean, are there any sort of real standouts to you that you've enjoyed, or?
Well, how do we define Nu-Trek? Because I've seen that applied to the Kelvinverse movies, and I've seen that applied to anything that post dates Voyager and the TNG movies. So
my logic would be to say anything that post dates Enterprise. If we rule Enterprise, which I think it's harsh because I like Enterprise, but equally I acknowledge that a lot of people regard it as the series that killed Star Trek. If we say Enterprise was like the end of that original run, you can say JJ is like the start of Nu-Trek, but it's sort of in its own world. It really only kicks off, and you don't exactly have many ships to talk about.
No.
Your real start, so I think Discovery onward really is the main, where we get most of these new ships.
Yeah. You see, the thing is, if you're going with that definition, there's almost there's almost, I'd say, 5 or 6, possibly more different blocks of ships that don't really have much to do with each other, because you've got the Kelvin verse, the JJ verse, which is its own thing. In terms of design, you've got Discovery, which, if we ignore the travel to the future part and we're looking just at the TOS section, because the 31st century stuff is going to be completely out of context. But if you look at the TOS era stuff that Discovery's got, that is its own thing, and there's almost a divide even there between season 1 Discovery and the rest. Although that's more
Strange New Worlds.
Strange New Worlds, is doing its own thing again. Picard.
It's basically SEO.
Yeah. Well, this is the thing. Picard season 1, to be honest, was very disappointing. But season 2 as you say, is almost STO the series. But looking at it from the ship design aesthetics, apart from the one ship they're wandering around in, the Star Trek Picard season 1, apart from that 2-second shot of the Enterprise D, you could almost be forgiven for believing that Starfleet had gone into retirement, because you basically see nothing of anything until the last episode, when it turns out that Starfleet is made up entirely of cookie cutter ships, which frankly weren't a particularly inspiring design to begin with.
No. I mean, this is the thing, and it's this is the thing of my feelings of I have such mixed feelings about season 2 of Star Trek Picard, because it entertained me. It made me laugh, even when I don't think it was trying to do that, but I'm not sure. But it was entertaining. But it was the thing, all of that kind of it was it almost made me forgive it because it had lovely starships and a nice moment with Q at the end. And it's if you just watch those first the first 2 episodes and then the last episode, and that was your knowledge of the series, you'd think it was brilliant. It would look so good. And the ships that we get in Picard season 2 are I liked the Stargazer class. I'm not sure if that's its proper title.
Yeah, I did like the kind of Mark II variants that they'd done, which they are fairly blatantly, like the Excelsior 2. They are fairly blatantly slight modifications of the STO updated versions. But compared to the here everybody have basically the same ship cloned 600 times at the end of Picard season 1.
Oh yeah, it's night and day better. My only real issue with it is that you have a modernized Miranda, and it's it's a Miranda of what?
Mm.
And there's the same thing with the Nebula. It's an updated Nebula. Okay, updated with what parts?
It's kind of a halfway thing, because on the one hand you can they more closely resemble Starfleet vessels, and you can look at them and go, yeah, that's kind of like a next generation tech version of this. So it fits the general Star Trek aesthetic a lot better than Picard Season 1. But then, yeah, as you say, in theory, if you were going to have a Nebula in the time period for Picard Season 2, you would probably, if you're going to have a nebularized ship, you'd be looking at either a nebularized Sovereign or possibly even a nebularized Odyssey.
Yes.
They're going to use the Star Trek Online assets rather than what is clearly a Galaxy class derived design that's been through a bunch of updates.
Yes. And that's my main kind of...
Yeah. It's a halfway house. At least they've got the aesthetics much close to what we were originally expecting, even if logically it doesn't make all that much sense.
Yes, I mean, for me, another one that, again, you mentioned Discovery Season 2, and one thing that did come out of that were the Section 31 ships. And the Nimrod.
I suppose we have to talk about those, don't we?
See, I don't like how they're used. I like the design. I don't like the battle, but I like this look.
I like the look in and of itself as like futuristic stealthy sci-fi spaceship. Yes. And I respect the fact that they've kind of kept a little bit they have kept to a degree of kind of like, it's not completely out of context. It's not like they've taken an Anubis class ship from the Expanse and plopped it in and gone, this is our stealth ship. It is quite clearly a Star Trek vessel.
Yes.
Just with some more hard edges and everything. The only problem I have with it is the same kind of problem I have with a bunch of other quote-unquote stealthy ships, which is that they're basically taking late 20th, early 21st century concepts of what makes up a stealth vessel and gone, this.
Yes.
I mean, it's basically it's an F117 with warp drives.
Yes, but
and I was like, surely they would have come up with something better than that in terms of how to do stealth in 300 years.
But it's because people still think the F117 looks stealthy, even though the F-22...
Yeah, I know it's an aesthetic thing, but it just annoys me a little.
Yeah, I mean, for me, the main reason I like it is because it's well, it doesn't fall victim to the USS Vengeance problem.
Yes, the negative,
Well, not even the negative space. With the USS Vengeance, it's an Enterprise. Because I've seen some people try to claim that it's an Excelsior, it's a JJ verse Excelsior. It isn't. It doesn't have any of the proportions to be an Excelsior for the JJ verse. An Excelsior in the JJ verse would look way better than the Vengeance. It's just a giant a big ugly grey bad guy ship.
Yes.
And that's all the character is. Whereas the Nimrod is actually a substantive, thought-out design of its own, and it does different things to the Discovery and the Enterprise.
And they've got a whole family of them. So there's someone's clearly put a fair bit of thought into it, even if I personally don't like the aesthetic too much. But they have put a fair bit of thought into it. It's... I suppose it is fundamentally the problem that everyone's going to be running into when you try and do something in the TOS era, which is basically either you have to do what TOS looked like or very close to it, or you're going to be updating things to a point where people are looking at it and going, oh, yeah, but it doesn't look exactly like...
yes. Yeah.
I think a lot of the Discovery designs, including Discovery herself, they did kind of tip a little bit too far over the edge, in my opinion, into looking a bit too futuristic.
Yeah. I mean, I kind of my main bone with Discovery isn't the pizza cutter saucer. I actually don't mind that terribly. what I really had the issue with was the extended nacelles.
Yes,
It
that,
just looks so silly.
yeah, that
You
and
see
the
it
overall
flying
size as well.
Again, I could kind of deal with the size because it's not JJ verse levels of size. It's
No.
like I say, it's a factor of like 1.25 or something like that.
Yeah, it's just for me, I've just kind of looked at it and gone, the TOS lore was that the constitutions were incredibly rare. They're the big flagships of the fleet. And then you have this thing that's actually significantly larger than a constitution in every dimension. And it's like, that's somehow a testbed ship. It's like, no. And again, we have this thing of the Starfleet testbed ships, the Oberth, the Nova, etc. The science vessels are always smaller than the big flagships. And now, all of a sudden, it's the other way around. But, oh well.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I don't mind. I like a TOSified Discovery. I think that looks all right. And it kind of makes sense for a sort of a long-range science ship as opposed to an Oberth or something else. Hi, guys. So we were forced to cut the last section short. So we're just kind of picking up here from where we left off. We were talking about the stealth ships in Discovery and, Section 31 ships in Discovery. So now I'm going to try and pin Drachinifel with a little bit of a question here. Of the Federation starships in Discovery, I'm thinking most of the ones that featured in the Battle of the Binary Stars, which is your preferred or favourite?
Oh, that's a tough one. I mean, there is this kind of thing. I mean, as we know with the TOS movies I think we mentioned it in a previous Q&A session, that Gene Roddenberry kind of took the position at one point that the motion picture Enterprise was how the Enterprise had always looked, and the TOS Enterprise was kind of like just the 23rd century TV series version of it. But obviously the TOS aesthetic has its own thing, its own following, which I find it very interesting, because the outside of Discovery herself, the ships, the other Starfleet ships that we see in, I guess, season 1, season 2 of Discovery, they kind of sit in this rather weird spot. They're very clearly not TOS the series ships. They kind of have this kind of halfway house between. You can see that they kind of are TOS movie designs, but at the same time they also have a degree of elements of Star Trek Online thrown in a lot of cases as well.
Yes. Well, then they get even more STO-ified in Star Trek Online, where they have the giant, which then have gone back into some of the ships in Picard.
Yeah,
I think the Shepherd or the Gagarin, as it's called, STO finds its way back in.
Yeah, you see, I don't mind most of the ships being TOSified, because it fits a version of canon, even if it's not necessarily one that most fans prefer. But it does show a certain respect to it. And the thing that's I mean, again, because this is an era where everything gets done in 4K, so you can understand they want more hull detail, etc. But at the same time, you kind of look at it and go, with a lot of these ships, if they just applied a relatively plain TOS movie era Aztecing pattern to them, they actually probably would fit relatively well. The main kind of STO-ifying of them is largely the hull texturing and coloration. The Buran very clearly is kind of a proto-Constellation class, except for the fact it's got all this black detailing on it, which is very STO-like. And don't take that, for people listening, don't take that as a knock at STO. I like STO. I've played that game on and off for years and years and years. but it is a little bit out of place in an era where if you collectively put together Enterprise, TOS the series and TOS the movies, everybody's hulls at that point are basically plain with maybe a bit of Aztecing. And then you just, with Discovery, you just have this random insertion of colour.
Yes, or well, in that particular instance, it's monochrome. You want to talk about inserting color. The ones to really talk about, and for me, they're the ones that are probably contenders for my preferred ships, are the Shenzhou and the Nimitz, because the Shenzhou has the red accents, which actually are not completely out of place, because the Enterprise has red pennants in the original series. It's a bit more, but it's a different color and a different look for a Starfleet ship.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, of all of them, I mean, one of the things I do appreciate is that when you look at these various ships, you can actually see the inspiration. They have clearly actually taken a degree of inspiration from existing TOS designs, because the Shenzhou is very much kind of a Miranda inspired vessel, and we already talked about the Buran, etc. They're all riffs on existing stuff we've seen, but I think if I was going to pick out a particular favourite of mine purely from an aesthetic point of view, I'd probably actually have to go purely based on aesthetics and general appearance. I'd probably actually have to go for the Kerala.
The Kerala?
Yeah. It's. I'll link you the picture so you know which one I'm on about.
Okay, because they get called different.
Yeah, they get called different things at different times. There you go.
Okay, yeah. The Shepherd.
Yes.
Yeah, I think it's called the Shepherd class.
Yeah.
That's very nice.
Yeah, it's kind of in a lot of ways it actually reminds me of a TOS movie era take on the original NX-01.
Yes, I mean the other thing it kind of has in common with is the Lochnar class, although the nacelles are not nearly at as steep an angle.
Yeah.
The main kind of tripping up point for me on both the Shepherd and the Walker class, between the two of them, is that one is just an upside down version of the other.
Yes,
with very limited differences. And I'm a great proponent of actually, yes, the upper, whether your nacelles are upright or downwards, despite there being no up and down in space, yes, it does actually matter and does make a difference to performance. But it does mean that, thinking about it in Discovery as well, when you've got these ships in action scenes dynamically moving about the screen, and they're going to end up moving in very similar ways. They don't necessarily bring a particularly different kind of dynamic to the fleet, as compared to my favorite, which is concretely my favorite. It's the most unique. Is the Nimitz class, the Europa?
Yes,
because it's again, as you say, it's basically a Miranda, and actually it's kind of also got some Nebula DNA in it, in as much as it has those secondary set of nacelles.
Yes, yeah.
Which is very much like Proto Nebula.
The Nimitz class is a strong runner up for me. It's just that from an engineering perspective, I look at them and I go, as I say, the Shenzhou has kind of got a lot of Miranda motifs to it, but it, in terms of overall canon, it leans just a little bit too much towards looking like an Akira. It's more like it's a little bit more like an Akira precursor than a Miranda precursor, which obviously, for the casual viewer who's first seeing Discovery, it may not matter, but for someone like us who's seen all the series, it kind of throws just a little bit. The Europa, as you said, it's pretty good, but for me personally, those upper nacelles, they remind me just a fraction. They remind me just a fraction of the Wolf 359 highlighter nacelle fleet.
Oh, and are you not a fan of those?
I'm kind of a fan of them, but I like them. They do flesh out the kind of the Galaxy era design era quite a bit, the TNG era. But at the same time, on some of them, not all, but on some, they are quite clearly, we made a thing, we need it to be a bit more distinctive, we're going to just slap these things on. And it's like, they've been around in canon long enough that people can justify them as torpedo launchers or a different nacelle design or whatever, depending on the class of ship. But there's just something about the placement of those upper nacelles that makes it look just a little bit too kit-bashy for my tastes.
See, I guess I've just sort of developed a soft spot for kit bashes over the years. I mean, the other thing that it kind of gets me thinking, looking at the way you have the bridge module, like on these wings between the two nacelles, is I do wonder. This is a very silly idea, although it actually might be hinted at by the design. It's hard to tell. That section could probably disconnect and just go off and be a little warp sled on its own.
It does kind of look that way, doesn't it? Yeah. At which point, what you're left with actually looks very much like a kind of Centaur Miranda predecessor. I mean, I don't hate it. I do like it to a certain degree, but the Shepard class takes it a little bit. It for me, it looks graceful, and it looks like a kind of an evolutionary link. Kind of if you put the NX-01, the Shepard, and the TOS movie era Enterprise in a line next to each other, you would like even the casual observer would go, oh yeah, there's a clear evolutionary line going on here.
Yeah, I think that is the thing. It does fit probably the most once you reconcile the scale.
Yes.
Which is I did that once. You basically take the size of the new Enterprise, divide it by the size of the original Enterprise, then you get your scale factor, and then just scale everything down. So,
yeah, and it's the sort of season 1, season 2 Discovery ships for mainline Starfleet. They are this kind of weird mix in that some of them look very much almost spot on as evolutionary steps between NX-01 era and full TOS era. And then others of them, you're kind of looking at them sideways and going, "What?" It's like, who came up with this thought? It's like some
yes.
It's one of the things that slightly annoys me when someone's clearly put a lot of thought into some of them, and not so much into the others.
And like the Hoover class. Yeah, that's. But I think that kind of covers Discovery quite well.
Yeah.
I think the next thing to talk about really is just lower decks and kind of, because I did a video talking about how that evolves the TNG aesthetic.
I genuinely like Lower Decks as a series, and as the because I mean, yes, it's a kind of almost cell shaded 3D animation style, and people have got to get with that idea that it's not the full 3D CGI, and it's not the full model work of previous Star Trek. So it's got a different feel to it overall. So that there's always going to be some changes, but of all the Nu-Trek sort of the 2010s, 2020s era Trek, it's probably the one that sticks the closest to the established technology style.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things that's I think perhaps interesting is that you've got one question, which is how old is the California class? Because it's quite big, like. So it can't be that old. Equally, it doesn't look like something they'd build for the Dominion War. You know, I think we
No,
talked
they
about
keep
this
calling
again
it about. They
previously.
keep calling it this kind of second line vessel.
It's like third or fourth line, probably,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah,
Because it is TNG era parts, pretty much.
yes. I mean, I quite like the California class as a concept. To be perfectly honest, it's kind of I guess it's a halfway house between a Miranda and a Nebula. It's got the everything below the saucer, Nebula style. It does actually have an engineering section of a sort, which the Miranda doesn't have. But that engineering section is kind of halfway between like a full engineering section, like a Nebula, or the kind of pod or whatever that you see on Mirandas and other similar vessels.
Yes, it also reminds me a lot of. See, one of the ways I wanted to scale it is because it's, I think, officially scaled at about 535 meters, which puts the saucer actually being bigger than an ambassador saucer. So I'd prefer to dial that back. Kind of the thing that really gets me is that the nacelles are very clearly, to me, the highlighter nacelles from the Cheyenne and the Springfield and so on.
Yeah.
They're very clearly those kind of nacelles. So that would make it even smaller, and they've just been, uncased. They've changed the intakes from being highlighter tips.
Yes.
But aside from that, it's that same DNA. But yeah, if you put it at 500 odd meters, you can't really justify that.
Yeah, I mean the saucer is a little bit of an odd one. Again, it's this weird mishmash because you've got the little engineering pod section is very clearly Galaxy era, TNG era. As you said, the nacelles are kind of this half a step back highlighter nacelles, which are kind of just about entering the TNG era, but they're kind of the last generation. And then you've got this saucer, which is perfectly circular, which the last time we see that is the Ambassador era, because by the TNG era they've gone for all these oblong shapes. But the layout of it and the windows and everything is very clearly TNG era.
Yeah,
I kind of wonder if maybe the California class's origins were actually as a test bed.
Okay, for what?
Just as a technology test bed. I mean, because some of the backstory, I can't remember whether it's Alpha or Beta canon for the Nova class, because of course originally the Nova class was, or a version thereof, was considered at first as the Defiant before they settled on the actual Defiant, and then if I remember correctly, it was then kind of shoehorned in that the Nova had been a test platform for some Defiant class systems before everyone had got turned around and gone, oh, hang on, actually this is like a small little pocket starship, we can probably use it as this generation's Oberth. I kind of wonder if the California class was this kind of technology test bed where they were looking around going, well, they've got this new deflector dish, which is kind of the Galaxy style deflector dish, and they've gone, right, well, we need to test that out, and also we want to test out this new interior layout to our saucers before they've decided on the oblong shape, but they're testing the inner layouts, and it's lots of little things. And then if this is happening around the time they're switching from Ambassador style to TNG style saucers, that would actually put it right in the ballpark timeline wise for the highlighter nacelles. So at that point, the nacelles would be the actual normal thing about them, and they've basically gone, well, here's this adapted Ambassador style saucer we've got, and here's this new deflector array, and we kind of need to test both of them, so let's just take a few pylons, slap something together and see how it works. And And then kind of like with the Nova class afterwards, they've gone, well, that was fairly cheap and easy. And then they've probably at that point got a bunch of little test bed deflector projectors and a bunch of maybe ex-ambassador or overproduction ambassador sources that they can refit, and they've just gone, well, slap them all together and call it a second line Starship. It's not particularly capable, but it's capable enough. Kind of a use up our spare parts bin kind of thing.
I mean, it is interesting because that actually then follows on very nicely as a sort of an explanation also for the, although it's much more impressive, for the Parliament class, which I think we covered in the as a sort of a battle cruiser.
Yes.
Because that's in that sort of, it's doing the same thing, but almost another generation later.
Yeah.
That sovereign, it's the sovereign style saucer with a next generation style set of nacelles, and then not a next generation set of nacelles, next generation style deflector,
Yeah.
and then Voyager style nacelles.
Yes. Which
so
again that would kind of make sense for it basically being the California class of the late TNG, early Voyager era.
Yes, but sort of still good. So it is interesting. It's almost like, the California class, or its sort of family of classes, is kind of the ones that are bridging the gaps between generations. They're sort of mixing and matching parts.
Yeah, which, I mean, for a fleet that is relatively speaking modular, because let's face it, the vast majority of Starfleet ships consist of nacelles, engineering hulls, and saucers with some kind of interconnectivity going on, and the occasional pod thrown in. It would make sense with those systems being almost separate to each other that the kind of I almost wonder if, given that, if you want to expand this kind of potential headcanon a bit further, given that when they tried to move on from the Constitutions to the Excelsiors, they did this wholesale shift, and then it almost blew up in their faces with the fact that transwarp didn't work.
Yeah, well, it took ages. Like, the big thing with that is that we see Excelsior in, I think it's 2284, 2285, and it doesn't really enter service until 2290, so that's 5 years after its initial trials. At which point they are already saying that the Constitution is old, because in search for Spock, they want to retire the Enterprise. They want to decommission her. Which, so they're getting ready to decommission these Constitution class ships before they even know that the Excelsior class is ready.
Yeah, and I just wonder if
who would do that? Who would get rid of a key piece of military equipment without first ensuring and securing its timely replacement?
Oh, I don't know, the early 2010s British government.
Yeah.
Oh dear. Yeah. I do wonder if maybe that taught Starfleet a big lesson, and then after that, every time they've gone through a generational shift, they've very carefully put together test beds. So they'll presumably be a test bed ship that's flying around with the modern advanced deflector, which probably is the Californias. Then there'll be starships that are flying around with the modern saucers, which kind of as their primary test unit, which is kind of the Parliament class. And elsewhere, you'll probably see ships flying around with the latest nacelles, otherwise made up of older parts. So in any case, there's only one part that's unknown, and I'm. You could kind of suggest at that point that there'd be maybe small, almost handcrafted, maybe 3-4 ship classes that are testing out each major component. And usually they're probably just test beds. They run around for a bit, everybody kind of works the issues out, and then they get decommissioned. But occasionally a particular combination might actually work as a general starship just well enough that they're like, well, actually, we're moving on to this latest and greatest new technology, but this kind of halfway house ship is decent enough, and it will be cheaper because it incorporates a bunch of older tech, so we can produce a bunch of these as kind of second line ships.
Yes, I mean, then you kind of get that logic taken to the extreme, or just to the absurdity in the Obena class, the Excelsior using sovereign parts.
The never-ending Excelsior.
It's the never-ending Excelsior, despite the fact that there's no way it can actually be an actual Excelsior hull whilst carrying Sovereign era and cells. I think have we covered this, or have I just talked about this ad nauseam?
No, I don't think we've talked about this particular ship before.
Okay, I've just talked with other people about it, because you end up with Sovereign era parts. Like, there's no way that properly scaled Sovereign nacelles are going to sit on an Excelsior in a way that looks good.
No. And then, of course, you have the Excelsior 2 in Picard. So someone in Starfleet clearly has a fascination for the Excelsior hull design.
Yeah, because the Excelsior 2 in Picard is like... I don't know if that's worse than the Obena. I think it's probably... If I'm being fair, it's probably more sensible because it's completely original parts. But I hate how thick the neck is. Like, I know one of the perks of the Excelsior is that it has a thick neck and it can't get, cut in half so easily. But by the time you get to that, it's really, taking the mick, to be frank.
Yeah, I mean, it kind of makes me think, based on historical reasoning, one of two things happened. Either someone very, very, very high up in the Starfleet Corps of Engineers or Starfleet Starship Design Bureau had basically spent their entire sort of frontline career in an Excelsior and really, really likes the Excelsior and forces people to keep building new versions of the Excelsior, even if they're limited production runs, just throughout time. Or possibly there's something about the Excelsior layout in general that works as a by this point a crew, as we said, a kind of a cruiser equivalent. The only thing I can think at that point is that because the Excelsior originally was designed for this incredibly high warp environment, very fast environment, then they'll probably get into some kind of really weird, completely made up stuff about subspace streamlining or something. But just looking at the relative size of the engineering hull versus the saucer on most Excelsiors, on most Excelsior-style designs, there is a lot more volume to the engineering hull relative to saucer volume as compared to most starships.
Yes. Yeah.
And I just wonder if maybe that combined with the fact it's very long, for whatever reason, somehow makes it very suited for prolonged high-speed operations. And maybe they're just like, well, it may come down to not so much the fact they're obsessed with the Excelsior class, but maybe it's just the Excelsior class has hit some kind of sweet spot of efficiency at high warp factors, and so someone's just like, well, we just need to keep doing something similar to that to get this kind of long distance high speed cruiser, even if as a hull as an actual overall hull design it's quite an old concept.
So, I actually liked your suggestion that there's somebody in Starfleet engineering who is just a complete fanboy of the Excelsior and makes them make new ones, because that's not actually as nearly as unrealistic as it first sounds.
Especially given how long-lived some Starfleet, some Star Trek species are. They could quite easily be like actually, for extra hilarity, just a really, really ancient Vulcan in like late 24th century Starfleet, who was maybe one of the inaugural crew on the Excelsior itself.
Yes, yeah.
served on the ship till it went out of service, and is now just like 250 years old, has been the head of Starfleet design for about 100 years and just won't let it go. But
yes.
this is his covert emotional outlet.
Yeah, or it's like there's a Starfleet version of, is it Colonel James Burton? Who wanted to keep the M113 over everything.
Oh yeah, that whole issue. I mean, and to be honest, even in naval terms, there have been in history various higher ups, whether that be admirals, politicians, or monarchs, who have either been obsessed over particular ships or particular design styles and have therefore kept by the fact that they're powerful enough to say you will do this, they've actually kept those things in service, or those designs being reproduced for far, 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 far longer than makes any sane or rational necessity. The one I'm particularly remember off the top of my head is the HMS Prince Albert, which clues in the name where that came from, but it's an early-ish Victorian era ironclad. But then, of course, as we know, towards the end of her life, Queen Victoria became so obsessed with anything to do with Prince Albert and his legacy, she refused to let the Royal Navy take it out of service.
Right.
And so you ended up with this ship, which by the time they finally managed to get rid of it, had absolutely zero combat value whatsoever. And hadn't done for a very, very, very long time, but they were just forced to gradually keep refitting it, in the hope that Queen Victoria would leave them alone. Because I mean, this thing was built 4 years after HMS Warrior.
Oh, blimey!
Yeah, and she's still pottering around at the end of the 1880s. They're only allowed to put her in reserve 2 years before the 20th century dawns. She's broken up just in 1899, and it's just like, that's that kind of higher ups keeping something long past its sell by date could very well be why Excelsior type designs keep getting popped out.
Well, and I think because it's hard to tell. It's hard to tell with certain kinds of higher ups. You get sort of different generations of officer. I'm just thinking the Excelsior generation was basically the last generation of militant Starfleet officers who had that kind of mindset. So they're perhaps a little less worried about being open-minded. They're less of that kind of open-minded diplomatic type, and more of that kind of old style rough and tough. I know how it's meant to go kind of thing.
Yeah, and probably with the various expansions that Starfleet's gone through, with the Borg, the Dominion War, and various other conflicts, etc., in the TNG and post-TNG era, they're probably you can imagine there's people trying to produce things like the Lunar class, the Sovereign class, etc., and that someone's just like, okay, I'll let you have the budget to do that, but in exchange you also have to produce this, which is like Excelsior version 7.0 or something. So you get a limited production run of those, and then they get shuffled off to wherever the like Excelsior 6.0 had patrolled earlier quietly, just to keep them happy.
I think that sounds right, and that's a nice explanation of the Abena.